Well, Donald Trump lost. Donald Trump lost in Florida tonight. Donald Trump endorsed a Republican congressman currently being investigated by the House Ethics Committee for possible domestic violence. And that Republican congressman, Corey Mills, lost in his Republican primary tonight, even with Donald Trump's endorsement in what is now Donald Trump's home state of Florida. The Washington Post reports that the House Ethics Committee, chaired by a Republican, quote, said it is investigating serious and complex allegations against Corey Mills, including possible domestic violence and campaign finance violations, based on a report from the Office of Congressional Conduct, which found Mills' campaign may have broken election finance law by accepting excessive contributions, and that he may have profited from federal contracts for arms while in Congress. Mills has denied these allegations, of course. Donald Trump endorsed that under investigation candidate. And why not? Donald Trump believes in profiting from holding federal office himself and has done so. Donald Trump proved once again tonight that his endorsement is not enough for Republicans to win. And Donald Trump's endorsement will be worth even less in a general election in November than it is worth in a Republican primary, especially if Donald Trump's war in Iran is still going on in November. With Donald Trump's endorsement of Corey Mills, Donald Trump was effectively saying to Florida voters, hey, you voted for me after you heard the Access Hollywood tape describing sexual assault, so why not vote for Corey Mills? The Washington Post reports, last October, a Florida judge granted an order of protection against Mills in favor of an ex-girlfriend who accused him of threatening her with revenge porn. The order of protection has since expired. Mills has denied the charges and said they were intended to damage him politically, and according to Florida voters, that is exactly what happened. It has damaged him politically. And it has proved that Donald Trump has lost his magical powers with Republican voters, even in Florida. Today, Donald Trump committed the crime of voting by mail. The man who is trying to outlaw voting by mail voted by mail.
We're the only country that does mail-in voting. Mail-in voting means mail-in cheating. I call it mail-in cheating. Mail-in ballots are inherently corrupt.
Mail-in cheating. Donald Trump did his mail-in cheating today. That's what he calls it. Donald Trump voted by mail because he hates the state that he currently calls home. Hates that state in summer, at least. Donald Trump finds Florida unlivable in summer, even in the age of air conditioning. And so he chose to vote by mail in Florida's election today. Donald Trump wants voting to be convenient for him, which means by mail, and significantly more expensive for everyone else, especially people who had to drive to the polls. Now that Donald Trump and his war has pushed the price of gas up over $4 a gallon. Here's what one Trump voter at the polls said today about Donald Trump's gas prices.
Gas shouldn't be that high, but everything, groceries, everything, we're just suffering right now.
That's right. Even Florida Trump voters say we're just suffering right now. And what does Donald Trump say to them?
When you have to pay a little bit more, you're at $4. It's okay. I mean, it's I'll never apologize. I did the right thing.
A majority of voters do not think that Donald Trump did the right thing by starting a war in Iran that has driven gas prices up from less than $3 a gallon to over $4 a gallon. And so on election night tonight, Donald Trump is scoring his absolute lowest approval rating in a Reuters poll, which shows him with a 33% job approval. That's down 2 percentage points from the same poll earlier this month. Donald Trump spent months saying his war in Iran would end in a couple of days. But the Reuters poll shows 80% believe Donald Trump's war in Iran will go on for an extended period of time, including 71% of Republicans who believe Donald Trump's war in Iran will go on for an extended period of time. 71% of Republicans. And yesterday, Donald Trump confirmed that those voters are right. He did that in one of those private phone call interviews with a reporter, this time with a Fox reporter, who quoted Donald Trump saying this about the end of his war: "I have no time schedule. I'm not in a hurry." So with 80% of Americans now believing that Donald Trump, who has always believed he's a great negotiator, cannot negotiate his way out of his war, Donald Trump is publicly agreeing with them and saying, "No, I cannot negotiate my way out of this war." Saying in fact, quote, "I'm not in a hurry." And Donald Trump saying "I'm not in a hurry" means Donald Trump has no idea how to negotiate his way out of the war he started with Iran. And in that very same telephone interview with that Fox reporter, Donald Trump said, "The midterms have nothing to do with my thinking." He is, of course, lying about that. He is desperately afraid of a Democratic Speaker of the House and a Democratic committee chairs in the House and in the Senate investigating Donald Trump and his family's plundering of the presidency. And so when Donald Trump says the midterms have nothing to do with my thinking, what he might really mean is, I can't think of anything to do that will help in the midterms. Donald Trump has not done a single thing to help Republicans win in November. He has only joined in Republican versus Republican primaries, and Donald Trump hasn't been able to win all of those. Donald Trump's candidate for governor in Minnesota was the My Pillow guy who didn't come close to winning the Republican nomination, even with Donald Trump's endorsement. Republican voters in Minnesota didn't care what Donald Trump thought about the clown candidate for governor who Donald Trump supported. We are not even halfway through Donald Trump's presidency, and Republican voters are increasingly saying, we don't care who Donald Trump endorses. Imagine what that might mean in the next presidential election if Donald Trump's endorsement loses value. J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio have been betting their entire political futures on the idea that Donald Trump will be the kingmaker in the next presidential election. What if he isn't? What if the whole country, including Republicans, has turned against Donald Trump 2 years from now? What if Donald Trump's endorsement for president is worth nothing 2 years from now, even in the Republican Party? Then who gets the Republican nomination for president? Then what becomes of J.D. Vance? Anything is possible between now and then, especially if Donald Trump's war is still going on then. And what we're seeing tonight with Donald Trump's disapproval ratings and with the weakness of his endorsements is that it is not impossible to imagine a Republican winning the next presidential nomination by running against Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump's war in Iran is still going on 2 years from now, then J.D. Vance might be trying to run for president against Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not just a pathological liar. He is a terrible liar. I mean, he is actually terrible at lying, just like he's terrible at everything else. And because he's terrible at lying and because he talks too much, the truth is often visible right there under his obvious and stupid lie. And so when Donald Trump says the midterms have nothing to do with my thinking, we have every right to believe that what we are hearing there are the words lying right on top of the truth, which is that Donald Trump feels helpless. Donald Trump feels lost. Donald Trump feels weak. Donald Trump feels there's nothing he can do to stop the Democrats from winning in November, and there's nothing he can do to stop his war. That new Reuters poll showed that more voters believe that Democrats will do a better job with the economy than Republicans, and more voters believe that Democrats will do a better job with the cost of living than Republicans. MS Now's Alex Tabbitt spoke to Trump voters outside a polling place in Orlando, Florida today.
Are you benefiting from this war?
No. Who's benefiting from it? Look at fuel prices. We went to Costco yesterday. It's ridiculous in there. Everything's expensive. Things are higher than they've ever been. All right? So we got to stop these wars. They cost time and money and lives.
That is what Trump voters in Florida sound like tonight.